The Tree of Life, Terrence Malick's 2011 film starring Brad Pitt, Jessica Chastain, and Sean Penn. Now, Terrence Malick is a rather interesting figure in the filmmaking world. Extremely private, doesn't ever really talk about his movies or how to interpret them. He doesn't offer a lot of insight into his own art. He only made three movies right before and in the 1970s, and then went silent for 20 years, only to come back in 1998. Since then, he directed a bunch of other films more regularly than before, of which I have previously seen two: The Thin Red Line and Song to Song. Two movies that were very different, as different thematically as they perhaps could be. The Thin Red Line is set in Guadalcanal during the Second World War, while Song to Song revolves around modern day music industry in and around Texas. Despite those different setups and settings, the movies are actually quite similar in more than one way. They're not too bound with traditional linear narrative, instead offering a series of scenes loosely bound and connected together, with not a lot of plot going on and even not a lot of dialogue. Malik likes to shoot all those scenes of people walking around, looking through windows thoughtfully, dancing, running, being in movement in general. And also a lot of shots of nature, always so prevalent in his movies. There's this running joke on the internet that every Malik film needs to have at least one shot of a person walking through a field of grass and running their hand through it. He often uses voiceover as his tool of narration, records actors softly speaking all those vague poetic lines about life, love, God, and whatever else. I've also read that what Malik usually does is just allow the actors to be in a moment, to sort of be not themselves, but the characters, to perform, and he just keeps the camera rolling all the time. And he then ends up with hundreds of hours of footage from which he edits the final film, which sometimes is completely surprising even to the actors. There's this famous anecdote of Adrian Brody going to the premiere of The Thin Red Line, convinced that he was one of the stars of the film, and then finding out that he was actually almost completely cut from the film. So Malik definitely has a very distinct style of filmmaking, and it's easy to recognize it when you're watching one of those movies. Question is, how well does it work? Now, I thought in The Thin Red Line it worked marvelously. I loved that film. I thought it did strike a good balance between that typical Malik's preferred lack of narrative, but also and him trying to evoke emotions more than anything, but also keeping the traces of normal storytelling that were actually still present from the novel that the movie was based on. Song to Song was a much weirder experience to me, a much weirder beast. I remember watching it in a movie theater and basically dying of boredom. It was a very tiring experience, as throughout the film almost nothing happens. I was constantly checking my watch only to find out that what felt like an hour was just 5 minutes. Weirdly enough, though, the movie then stayed with me for quite some time after leaving the movie theater. I used to remember certain scenes and think about them a lot, and certain moods that the scenes evoked. To think how the film made me feel after the fact. So watching it was terrible, but then thinking about it afterwards was much better and quite enjoyable. So now I'm coming into The Tree of Life, which is hailed by many, many critics as Malik's greatest achievement, perhaps, and one of the best movies of the almost ending decade. The question for me was, which of these experiences was I going to have now, the Thin Red Line one or the Song to Song one? And the answer is neither exactly, but unfortunately, if I had to pick one, it would be more of a Song to Song. So, The Tree of Life is basically Sean Penn having a sort of midlife crisis, walking around an office building made of steel and glass, and reminiscing about his childhood in Texas in the 1950s or 60s, living with his brothers and being raised by his parents with wildly conflicting ideologies and outlooks on life. And there's also a sequence about the creation of the universe that lasts about 20 minutes and has no connection to the rest of the film whatsoever. Anyway, first thing that needs to be said is this, before I start complaining, and believe me, I will. It's that similarly to other Malik movies, this one looks absolutely gorgeous. The way he makes the camera capture images is simply stunning. It's like every frame is a painting. Honestly, it definitely is one of the prettiest films I ever watched. I was trying to think what it was exactly, specifically, that makes Malik's style of shooting stand out so much, the cinematography. And I think it mainly comes down to movement. The vast majority of the scenes depict people, as I previously mentioned, moving around, walking, running, playing, dancing. But also the camera itself is constantly on the move, never stationary. And the movements of the camera are very fluid. They make it seem like it's floating in the air around the characters and around the scenery. Again, this cannot be overstated. It is a beautiful film. Uh, Beautiful but hollow. Once again, Malik drops all standard narrative for the sake of creating this dreamlike experience. Almost no dialogue, absolutely no plot, and a lot of scenes which who the fuck knows what they're even about. Soft voiceovers, speaking poetry as usual. It's all here. Problem is, in Thin Red Line it worked well. In Song to Sell it sort of kind of worked because it at least stayed with me. With The Tree of Life, nothing did stay with me. I really stopped thinking about the movie as soon as it ended, and with a relief, because it's probably the most boring, gruesome, excruciatingly tiring cinematic experience I ever had. I'm glad I was watching at home because after an hour I needed to take a break and basically take a nap. I couldn't go on. In a movie theater, I would probably just walk out and never finish the film. Seriously, it's a 2 hour movie that feels like 4 months have passed since you start watching it, and you're just stuck with it. Worst part is, it doesn't really offer anything else in place of the lacking narrative that would draw you in. I don't think it's thought provoking. I don't think it awakens emotions. I don't think it's touching in any way, as many critics apparently do. I think it's pretentious as hell and not much more than that. I went on the internet after seeing it because I was curious how people justify their high opinions, of which there are many. Because maybe, I missed something. Maybe I approached it in a wrong way. Maybe I didn't notice some crucial element. But no, all the praise just focuses on the looks of the film and the apparent emotional impact it had on people. Well, it didn't have any on me, so I don't know. Maybe I'm too dull for this type of film, maybe it's my fault, but for the life of me, I cannot fathom how one can connect with this movie and love it. Especially as a lot of people defending the film also praise the lack of narrative structure and say that the depth of the film has to be found elsewhere. But where? Well, that's the beauty of it, because no one can tell you where. It's for you to decide. You can interpret it however you want, but nobody will ever tell you how they interpret it specifically. They just tell you that they liked it. So, in this way, I honestly think it kind of is a cinematic masturbation. It's jacking off to how poetic and fleeting and ambiguous and deep Terrence Malick supposedly is. No, not for me. It wasn't deep. It wasn't poetic. For me, it's just hollow and boring. Interestingly, I also, while scouring the net, I also found an interview with Sean Penn, one of the lead actors, who said after seeing the final film that he was disappointed because apparently there was a script to the film and it would have taken the movie in a much different and much more interesting direction. And seeing how Sean Penn is a talented filmmaker himself, I'm kind of inclined to believe him on that one. So the last question that came to mind for me while I was preparing for this video that I hoped I would be able to answer was this: does the Tree of Life actually have this greatness in it? Is it this sort of litmus test for how educated of a cinephile you actually are, if you're able to appreciate it, or is it just completely worthless and a boring drag of a movie? And honestly, I'm still not quite sure. For me, it's definitely the latter. The movie didn't work. It didn't produce any emotion aside from frustration, but apparently it did for other people. And film is a subjective art form, and maybe for some it truly is a masterpiece. I just don't know at the end of the day if I should envy those people or be glad that I'm not part of this club.